All right, buckle up because we're going deep into the world of finance today, folks. We're talking about The Big Short, Michael Lewis's incredible look at the 2008 housing crisis. How did a handful of investors see it coming and, bet against the system and make billions? That's what we're going to unpack.
It's a wild story, that's for sure. I mean, we're going right into the heart of Wall Street, right? Exposing all that risky behavior, that flawed thinking that led to, well, a global financial meltdown.
And it all started way before the actual crash, right? Back in
Right.
the 80s, which Lewis, he actually wrote about in his book, Liar's Poker, thinking that he was, witnessing the end of an era of excess.
Yeah, he thought he was chronicling the end, but
Yeah.
ironically, that excess, it just kept growing, setting the stage for the whole subprime mortgage mess years later.
Yeah.
You know what's really interesting? Lewis actually kind of foreshadowed the whole mortgage bond market danger in Liar's Poker. But even he didn't fully realize, how bad it could get.
It's amazing how, like, history can kind of repeat itself. Okay, so fast forward to 2007. Housing market is booming. Everything seems great. But then cracks start to appear, right? And then you've got Meredith Whitney. This relatively unknown analyst drops a bombshell on Wall Street.
Oh, yeah, her prediction about Citigroup, that they were sitting on all these bad assets and would have to slash their dividend. That sent shockwaves through the market. It wasn't even that she was accusing Wall Street of corruption like many had before.
Right, it was more like she was saying they were incompetent,
Yeah. They didn't even understand the risks they were taking.
which is almost worse.
Oh, way worse. Way more damaging than any scandal.
Okay, so let's meet one of the main players in our story, Steve Eisman. Brilliant, but a little eccentric hedge fund manager who just distrusted Wall Street deeply.
Eisman, he just had this talent for spotting inconsistencies, and he did not care about challenging the status quo, even if it meant, like, disappearing in the middle of meetings to make a point.
Okay, disappearing during meetings, that's a new one. But beneath all those quirks, there's actually a pretty tragic backstory that shaped his view of the world. The loss of his instant son, it really left him with this feeling that the world was unpredictable and often, just unfair.
Right, in that experience, you combine that with his background in analyzing subprime lending back in the 90s. It gave him a unique perspective on what was happening.
So he's seeing all these warning signs that everyone else is missing. But to understand those signs, we need to go back and look at subprime lending, how it evolved.
Okay, so it all began with the shift in the mortgage bond market. It moved away from focusing on, prepayment risk and instead started accepting, even obscuring the risk of no repayment at all.
That sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Oh, it was. A total recipe for disaster. Wall Street started packaging subprime mortgages, which are loans made to people with, not so great credit. They bundled them into these bonds and then sold them to investors. It's called the originate and sell model. Basically, they were just shifting the risk off their books onto someone else.
Like selling a ticking time bomb and walking away.
Yeah, exactly, a ticking time bomb. And there were a couple of analysts, Cy Jacobs and Eisman. They really understood both the potential and the danger of this whole system. They saw how it could expand access to homeownership, which was good, but they were really wary of the, I guess you could say, shady practices that were becoming so common.
It sounds like greed and disregard for risk were taking over. But this is where it gets really interesting. We've got to talk about Mike Burry. Brilliant, socially awkward, doctor-turned-hedge fund manager. And, oh yeah, he has Asperger's syndrome.
Burry is a fascinating character, that's for sure. And all those personality traits, like his obsession with facts, logic, honesty, they actually made him perfectly suited to uncovering market inefficiencies. He could just sift through data, spot patterns that others missed. It was almost superhuman.
He literally saw the world differently.
He did. It all goes back to his childhood, actually. He had this experience with the glass eye that really shaped how he saw things, made social interaction tricky, and he took things very literally. And that, combined with Asperger's, it fueled this intense focus he had, this need for, absolute accuracy.
So he wasn't swayed by hype or emotion, just the data.
Just the data, wherever it led. And that's how he achieved that incredible early success managing his hedge fund, Scion Capital. Focused on undervalued companies, avoided that risky leverage everyone else relied on.
Basically proving that being different, thinking differently, huge advantage in the market.
Absolutely, a huge advantage. And in the case of the housing market, it would make all the difference. So we've got Mike Burry betting big against the housing market, but Wall Street is still churning out those mortgage bonds, seemingly oblivious to the ticking time bomb. This is where things get even crazier with the rise of something called synthetic CDOs.
Synthetic CDOs, okay.
Imagine taking those already risky mortgage bonds, bundling them together, and then creating another bet on whether that entire bundle will fail. That's essentially what a synthetic CDO is, a bet on a bet.
Whoa, a bet on a bet. That sounds wild.
And Wall Street was creating these things by the billions, amplifying the risk already present in the system.
Okay, my head is spinning a little bit here. But the bottom line is these synthetic CDOs were incredibly complex and incredibly risky.
Exactly. And
Right.
Goldman Sachs was one of the major players creating and selling these synthetic CDOs, generating billions in profits. But it wasn't just Goldman. Enter Greg Lippmann, a trader at Deutsche Bank who initially pitched subprime CDOs to investors, but later had a change of heart.
Wait, so he was on the side of creating these financial monsters at first.
He was, but Lippmann was a sharp guy. He eventually recognized just how unstable these synthetic CDOs were and decided to bet against them. To bolster his arguments, he even brought in a quantitative analyst, Eugene Zhu, whom he referred to as his Chinese quant.
A Chinese quant. What's the story there?
Well, Lippmann played up the fact that Zhu was this brilliant mathematician who had placed second in a national math competition in China. Since Zhu didn't speak English, Lippmann would joke, "How can a guy who can't speak English lie?"
Uh-huh. That's some clever marketing.
It worked. People were more inclined to trust Lippmann's analysis because of this Chinese quant who supposedly validated his numbers.
So Lippmann starts betting against the market, but what's fascinating is that his attempts to warn AIG, the insurance giant, about the dangers of these toxic assets actually contributed to the market's collapse.
That's the irony of it all. He was trying to get AIG to stop insuring these ticking time bombs, but instead they just dug themselves in deeper, believing they were covered.
It's like trying to warn someone about a fire while accidentally throwing gasoline on it.
A perfect analogy. Now, speaking of AIG, we need to step inside their financial products division and meet the man in charge, Joe Cassano.
Oh boy. I've heard stories about this guy. He didn't exactly have a reputation for being cautious.
That's putting it mildly. Cassano was known for his dictatorial management style, his reliance on bullying and money as motivational tools, and, most importantly, his lack of understanding of the risks his division was taking. He created a culture of fear where no one dared challenge his decisions, even when it was clear they were heading for disaster.
So the guy responsible for ensuring all these crazy bets didn't even fully grasp the dangers involved.
Not really, and as long as the money was flowing in, no one seemed too concerned. But back on the other side of the equation, the short sellers were becoming increasingly convinced that the market was about to implode.
Eisman, in particular, was on a mission to expose the fraud and deception he saw running rampant throughout the subprime mortgage market. He was like a dog with a bone, digging deeper and deeper into the underbelly of the system.
And this is where his famous confrontation with Wing Chao comes in. Chao was a CDO manager who epitomized the reckless disregard for risk that was so prevalent on Wall Street.
Eisman was appalled by Chao's lack of concern for the investors he was managing money for. He saw Chao as nothing more than a puppet for Wall Street, helping them peddle their toxic assets.
What's even more absurd is that Chao admitted to Eisman that he didn't even really analyze the contents of the CDOs he managed. He was just churning them out to maximize the fees he could collect.
It's a perfect example of how perverse incentives can lead to catastrophic outcomes. But while Eisman was battling it out with the Wall Street establishment, there was another group of investors with a much different background who were also stumbling onto the opportunity to short the housing market.
You're talking about Charlie Ledley, Ben Hockett, and Jamie Mai, the founders of Cornwall Capital. These guys were running their hedge fund out of a Berkeley coffee shop.
Wait, a coffee shop? That doesn't exactly scream high finance.
I know, right? But these guys were brilliant in their own way. They had this unconventional belief that the best investments were found by betting on what Wall Street thought was least likely to happen.
Which in this case was a collapse of the seemingly unstoppable housing market.
Exactly. They were initially skeptical, but the more they dug into the mechanics of CDOs and the flaws in the ratings agency's models, the more convinced they became.
So these guys who started out in a coffee shop ended up seeing the same warning signs as the Wall Street veterans. It's amazing how sometimes the most unlikely people can make the biggest discoveries.
It really is. But even with all the evidence mounting, the short sellers faced a frustrating reality. The subprime market was still booming.
It's like watching a train barreling toward a cliff while everyone on board is partying like there's no tomorrow.
That's a great analogy. Eisman was even facing pressure from his own investors and risk management team to reduce his short position. They just couldn't believe the market would actually crash.
Talk about frustrating. It must have been incredibly difficult to maintain your conviction when everyone around you was doubting you.
And Burry was facing similar challenges. Some of his investors, impatient with his macro bet, demanded their money back even as his meticulously crafted trade began to pay off.
It just shows how hard it can be to stay the course when you're going against the grain. It takes incredible conviction and, let's be honest, a bit of stubbornness.
Well, Burry definitely had both in spades. He ended up side-pocketing his credit default swaps, essentially locking up his investors' money to protect his position.
Wait, side-pocketing, what does that mean?
It's a way of separating illiquid assets, in this case, the credit default swaps, from the rest of the fund's holdings. It essentially prevents investors from withdrawing their money from those specific investments.
So he was that confident that his bet would pay off, even though his investors were getting cold feet. That's a bold move.
It was. But as the cracks in the subprime market widened, one of the biggest players on Wall Street was about to make a colossal blunder that would highlight just how deep the rot had spread.
You're talking about Morgan Stanley, right?
Yeah.
Specifically, Howie Hubler, the trader who lost billions betting on subprime CDOs.
Exactly. Hubler, believing in the infallibility of the ratings agencies, amassed a $16 billion position in AAA-rated subprime CDOs.
$16 billion. That's an insane amount of money to bet on something so risky.
It is. But Hubler and his team were convinced these CDOs were safe, thanks to those flawed ratings. And what's even crazier, their bet was virtually invisible to Morgan Stanley's risk management system.
How is that even possible? You'd think a bank like Morgan Stanley would have sophisticated systems to track these kinds of risks.
They did, but their models were based on faulty assumptions that didn't account for the possibility of a widespread housing market collapse.
So they were flying blind, essentially. And as we know, Hubler's bet would go down as the single largest trading loss in Wall Street history. A truly spectacular failure.
Indeed. And as 2008 rolled around, the subprime mortgage crisis reached its climax, and the fallout was devastating.
Lehman Brothers collapsed, Merrill Lynch was sold to Bank of America, and AIG, the insurance giant that had insured so many of those toxic assets, needed a massive government bailout.
It was a period of unprecedented panic and chaos in the financial markets. The U.S. government had to step in with trillions of dollars to rescue failing banks.
Essentially transferring the risk from Wall Street to the taxpayers.
Yes, and unfortunately, there was very little accountability for the individuals and institutions that were responsible for the crisis. It's a sobering reminder that even in a supposedly highly regulated system, catastrophic failures can occur, and the consequences can be felt for years to come.
So the dominoes have fallen, everything's a mess, our short-selling guys are watching it all happen. What's their reaction? I mean, you'd think there'd be some satisfaction, vindication, but I imagine it's more complicated than that, right?
It is. It's really fascinating how differently they each reacted. Some were relieved, some horrified, some just plain confused. Like, take Steve Eisman, for instance. He'd been so sure about the collapse, almost like, Cassandra.
The guy warning everyone, but nobody believed him. So what happened when he was proven right? Did he become some kind of financial guru?
Well, in a way, yeah. People wanted to know how he saw it coming, but the crisis also made him look inward, Remember, he wasn't exactly known for being socially smooth.
That's putting it mildly. He seemed to enjoy being the contrarian.
Right, but his wife, Valerie, she saw a change in him after the crash. He started to, develop some tact, become more empathetic. It was as if the whole thing, the scale of the suffering, it made him grow as a person.
That's actually pretty heartwarming. Shows that even someone like Eisman could be affected by the human side of it all.
Okay, now, Mike Burry. He's another interesting case. Remember, he was dealing with a lot before the crash. Skeptical investors, pressure to change his strategy, the stress of being so out of step. Then his bet pays off big time, and he doesn't celebrate.
That's weird. Why not?
Because for Burry, it was like a symptom of a much bigger problem. He'd won the bet, but the game was rigged. He saw the financial system as just flawed, full of bad incentives, moral hazard.
So vindicated, but also troubled by the whole experience.
Exactly. And he closed his fund, walked away from Wall Street completely.
Wow, what a statement. Predicted the crisis, made a fortune, walked away.
Shows you, for him, it was about truth, exposing the system's flaws, not just money.
Okay, we've talked about Eisman, Burry. What about the Cornwall Capital guys? They seemed less about making a point and more about, finding market opportunities. How did they take it?
Well, it was excitement and worry mixed together. They turned 30 million into 135 million. Not bad for a coffee shop operation.
Not bad at all, but you said worried. Why?
They were seriously concerned about the whole financial system, They saw how close it came to collapsing, worried about where to even put their money safely.
Like winning Monopoly, but then someone flips the board over.
That's it. What good is the money if the game's over? They even talked to a financial historian trying to understand what it all meant.
So successful, but still processing the whole thing, the consequences.
Absolutely. And that's important. Even those who game can see the damage.
It's not just numbers. It affects real people.
Exactly. Now, Lewis, he ends The Big Short with this epilogue, reflecting on his time on Wall Street. He basically says the system's always going to be flawed because it rewards complexity, short-term profits, overstability.
The black box idea, right.
Yeah.
Even regulators don't fully get it.
Right. So, the big question, how do we prevent this again? Can we even fix a system so prone to this?
$1 million question. Easy to blame people, but The Big Short suggests it's deeper than that.
It is, and it's something economists, policymakers, everyone's still thinking about. Lewis, he talks about transparency. If people can see the risks, maybe they won't get out of control.
Shining a light, so to speak.
Then there's incentives. If you're making the bets A and D, taking the losses, you'll be more careful.
Skin in the game?
And of course, regulation, finding that balance. But no system's perfect. Someone's always going to try to game it.
That's just human nature, but we can still try to make it cover.
Absolutely, and that's where The Big Short is so valuable. By understanding how it happened, who did what, the mistakes, we can hopefully learn, make better choices.
History might not repeat, but it rhymes, as they say.
Well said. So as we wrap up our deep dive into The Big Short, one last thought for our listeners. Imagine you're those guys who predicted it all. Knowing what you know now, what would you have done differently? Warn more people, walk away, or, take advantage.
Tough one. Judging from afar is easy, but being in it with all that complexity.
It is. No easy answers. But by thinking about these things, understanding this world, we can all be more informed, more engaged, maybe even help prevent the next Big Short.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, folks. It's been a wild ride. Hopefully we've illuminated this huge event. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.